What happens when two armies, positioned only a few dozen meters apart in the mud, stop shooting and begin to sing? It happened once, during the first winter of the most industrialized war the world had ever seen. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The question at the center of this episode is simple. How did men who were ordered to end each other's lives choose, for a brief moment, to share food and song instead? Tonight, we turn to a moment in December of 1914 that briefly interrupted the machinery of war. We ask what made it possible and why it could never happen again.
The answer lies not in heroism or ideology, but in the specific and unrepeatable conditions of that first winter. The war was new, the trenches were improvised, and the distance between opposing soldiers was sometimes no greater than the width of a narrow street.
We are speaking about the Christmas Truce of 1914.
It was a spontaneous and unauthorized ceasefire that emerged along parts of the Western Front, driven not by command, but by shared cold, shared exhaustion, and the sound of a familiar carol rising from the opposing line.
Then let us begin with the conditions that made such a thing possible at all.
By December of 1914, the Western Front had already settled into a form of warfare that no one had anticipated. The initial rapid movements of August and September had collapsed into stalemate, and both sides had begun to dig. The trenches stretched from the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland, a distance of several hundred kilometers. In many sectors, the opposing lines were separated by as little as 50 to 100 meters of open, torn ground round.
So, the soldiers could hear each other.
Exactly. They could hear voices, laughter, coughing. They could smell food being cooked. In some places, soldiers had already developed informal local agreements, unspoken pauses in firing during mealtimes or at dusk. This is the part that tends to surprise people. The Christmas truce was not a single coordinated event. It grew out of a pattern of small local accommodations that had been forming for weeks before the 25th of December.
So the common image of a sudden, spontaneous peace breaking out all at once on Christmas morning is not quite accurate.
Yes, that image is compelling, but it flattens the reality. Truce was uneven, localized, and emerged from a longer process. In some sectors it never occurred at all, and fighting continued through the entire holiday period without pause. But where it did happen, the sequence was remarkably consistent. It began with sound. On the evening of the 24th, soldiers on the British side began to notice lights appearing along the German parapet.
Lights in the trenches.
Small candles placed on improvised Christmas trees, which German units had received as part of a supply distribution from home. Then came the singing. German soldiers began to sing traditional carols, including ones that British troops recognized from their own tradition. The shared musical heritage was not accidental. Many of the carols sung in British churches at Christmas had German origins. Soldiers on both sides recognized the same melodies, even if the words differed.
So culture provided a bridge that command structures had not authorized.
Exactly. And this is where it shifts from curiosity to something historically significant. British soldiers began to respond, first with their own songs, then with shouts across the lines, then with cautious movement toward the open ground between them. Accounts from letters and diaries described the first steps into no man's land with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Men who had spent weeks learning to see the opposing trench as a source of mortal danger walked toward it, hands visible, often holding small offerings.
So the act of stepping out was itself an enormous risk.
Yes, there was no guarantee that the other side would not open fire. The first men to step forward were taking a risk based entirely on a feeling, on the sense that the singing and the light signaled a genuine pause. And in most cases that feeling was correct. Once soldiers from both sides were standing in the open, the dynamic changed entirely. They shook hands, they exchanged names, they shared what they had: tobacco, food, small personal items. In some cases they showed photographs of their families.
And the football matches. That detail appears constantly in popular accounts.
It does. And there is documentation for at least some informal games taking place in open areas between the lines. But the football story has grown somewhat beyond the evidence. Not every sector had a match, and the accounts vary considerably in detail. What is better documented, and in some ways more striking, is the joint recovery of those who had passed away in the open ground. In several sectors, soldiers from both sides worked together to retrieve and bury the fallen who had lain in no man's land for days or weeks.
So the truce was not only about celebration, it also involved a shared solemn work.
Exactly, and that detail reveals something important about the psychology of the men involved. They were not simply taking a holiday from the war. They were behaving as human beings who recognized the humanity of the person on the other side of a narrow strip of land. This is the turning point in understanding the truce. It was not a breakdown of will or courage. It was a moment in which the abstraction of the enemy, constructed and maintained by military discipline and propaganda, briefly dissolved on contact with a real person.
So, the system of war depends on maintaining a certain distance, a certain unreality about the opposing soldier.
Yes, and what the Christmas truce exposed inadvertently was how fragile that construction was in the specific conditions of 1914. The proximity of the trenches, the shared cold, the shared festival, and the shared musical heritage created the conditions for that construction to fail. The military authorities on both sides understood this immediately. When reports of fraternization reached higher command, the reaction was not celebration.
So command saw it as a threat.
Yes, orders were issued at various levels warning against any repetition. Some officers who had participated or permitted the truce in their sectors were reprimanded. The concern was not primarily moral, it was operational. A soldier who has shared tobacco with the man in the opposing trench is a soldier whose willingness to fire upon that man has been corporated. The military machine required that soldiers maintain a clear and functional relationship with the idea of the enemy as an object of combat.
And yet it happened anyway, without authorization across multiple sectors.
Exactly. And that is the paradox the truce presents to historians. It demonstrates both the fragility of the military construction of the enemy and the ultimate resilience of the structures that sustained the war. The truce happened. The war continued for 4 more years. By the following Christmas, the character of the war had changed significantly. The battles of 1915 had increased casualties and hardened attitudes. The artillery barrages were longer and more destructive. The distance between opposing lines had in many places increased.
So the physical conditions that had made the truce possible were deliberately altered.
In part, yes. It was not only physical distance, it was also the weight of accumulated loss. By December of 1915, both sides had suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. The men in the trenches were not the same men who had arrived in 1914. New recruits had been trained with greater emphasis on sustained hostility. The informal codes of behavior that had developed in the early months, the unspoken agreements about mealtimes and vulnerable moments, were actively discouraged by command in the second year.
So the system learned from what happened and adjusted.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most sobering conclusion one can draw from the Christmas truce. The event itself changed very little. It did not shorten the war, did not produce any negotiated agreement, did not alter the political conditions that had produced the conflict. What it did reveal was that the systems sustaining the war were not natural. They had to be constructed and maintained actively, through discipline, through propaganda, through the careful management of how soldiers understood their situation.
So the truce is, in a strange way, evidence of how much effort it takes to keep a war running.
That is a precise way to put it. War at the scale of the First World War was not a natural state. It required continuous institutional effort to maintain. The Christmas truce is the moment that effort briefly lapsed, and what emerged in the gap was something considerably more ordinary. Men talked, men sharing what they had, men performing the rituals of recognition that mark the presence of another human being who resembles oneself. The immediate historical reception of the Christmas truce was complicated. In the days that followed, some accounts appeared in British newspapers, often framed as evidence of the essential goodness of the common soldier on both sides. But the official response was suppression rather than celebration. Military censors limited what could be published, and many of the letters describing the truce in detail were held back or edited before reaching home.
So the story was managed from the beginning.
Yes. The authorities understood that a story about soldiers refusing to fight was not a story that supported continued enlistment or public morale. It was a story that raised uncomfortable questions about the necessity and the meaning of the war. The fuller story of the truce only became widely known in the decades after the war ended, as personal letters, diaries and memoirs were published and studied. By the middle of the 20th century, the Christmas truce had begun its transformation into a cultural symbol.
So its significance grew over time, rather than being recognized immediately.
Exactly, and as it grew it was often simplified. The nuance, the fact that the truce was partial and localized, that it did not represent a universal human impulse but a specific set of conditions, was frequently lost in the retelling. In film, in literature, in advertising, the Christmas truce became a story about the natural goodness of ordinary people, overcoming the artificial divisions created by their leaders. This reading is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand how the Christmas truce unfolded and what it meant, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Silent Night, the story of the World War I Christmas truce by Stanley Weintraub.
So this is a reconstruction built directly from the letters and diaries that soldiers left behind.
Exactly that. Weintraub draws on personal testimony from both the British and German sides to reconstruct how soldiers initiated contact, shared songs, and temporarily suspended combat. He also examines how military authorities responded and why the truce did not recur on the same scale.
And is it a book that a reader without specialist knowledge of the period can follow?
It is. Weintraub writes with clarity and does not assume prior knowledge of the military or political context. The book is structured around the events themselves, moving through the days of late December with a close attention to individual accounts that makes it feel immediate rather than academic.
So reading it gives you not only the facts but the texture of what those days felt like to the people who were in them.
That is what makes it valuable. It holds the personal and the historical in balance, and it resists the temptation to romanticize what was, at its core, a brief interruption in a very long and very costly war.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
So, the popular version tends to separate the soldiers from the system they were part of.
Yes, and the historical version insists that the two cannot be separated so cleanly. The soldiers who participated in the truce were not rebels. They returned to their trenches. They resumed fighting. Many of them continued to serve for years afterward. The truce was a momentary suspension, not a rejection. And that distinction matters because it tells us something accurate about the relationship between individuals and the large institutional structures that shape their behavior.
So people can recognize the humanity of someone they are required to treat as an enemy, and still return to treating them as an enemy.
Yes, that is one of the more difficult conclusions the Christmas truce forces us to sit with. Moral recognition and institutional compliance can coexist. The soldiers knew who they were looking at. They chose to return to their positions anyway. This is not a failure of character. It reflects the power of the structures in which those men were embedded, the weight of duty, of loyalty to their comrades, of fear of punishment, of the sheer momentum of a war already in motion.
So, the truce is evidence of individual humanity, and simultaneously evidence of how little individual humanity can do against institutional momentum.
Exactly. And this is why the Christmas truce continues to be studied and discussed not only as a curiosity of military history, but as a case study in the relationship between human behavior and institutional constraint. The relevance extends well beyond the trenches of the first winter. Any situation in which individuals are required by their institutional role to maintain a posture of hostility toward people they might otherwise recognize as similar to themselves carries the same underlying tension.
So the question the truce leaves us with is not only historical.
No, the question it leaves is this. When the institutional demand to treat another person as an adversary briefly falls away, and what remains is simply two people standing in the cold, what do we do with that recognition when the institution reasserts itself?
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the conditions, the moments, and the lasting questions left by the Christmas truce of 1914.
The war lasted 4 more years after those few days of singing. That alone tells you everything about the distance between a moment of recognition and the power of the systems that surround it.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.